it was not a sophisticated attack, but the adversary was kind of very sophisticated, I would say. And if you look at a couple of unique points in terms of security challenges with such infrastructure, is that there were a lot of numerous sites which needs to be secured across wider geographic areas. So if you have got standardized configuration across these multiple sites, then even if you are able to successfully penetrate into one site, you can snowball it into multiple repeatable attacks on the same infrastructure across different geographic areas.
Welcome back to Season 3 of OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. And speaking of challenges, I have to apologize for our complete lack of an episode last month. I won't bore you with the details, but suffice it to say, for a month, we didn't have the ability to post a new episode until those all got sorted through. So anyways, we're back now. It's March. And before we dive into the topic, we should probably go around and introduce ourselves. It's a smaller crowd today, and we'll see if anybody else joins, but Natalie Kalinowski is back with us.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be back.
And new to the podcast, but hopefully a voice will have returning a few times, we have Mustafa Amir.
Hi everyone, Mustafa Amir here from the scene of the global conflict happening from UAE.
Yeah, you are a little closer to the hot zone than either of us are.
Yeah.
Actually, my wife was remarking to me this morning. She's just like, I guess I'm glad they sent you there last year.
You were back at the right time.
Yeah. So, yeah. So just to fill in some context there, Mustafa is out of our UAE office. Obviously, it's a bit of a hot zone right now in the Gulf region. But he and I met when I was also over there supporting a project in Saudi Arabia. So he expressed interest in joining the podcast. And so this is the first time we've had a chance to get him on a recording. And trying to keep it with current events, but also when we were tossing around ideas for last month's episode, Natalie posted a really great article in our little Teams chat, which was talking about some power infrastructure attacks that happened kind of over the Christmas, New Year's 2025 and just into 2026. One of which was in Poland. I think another was in Germany. The one you posted was from Poland. And then there was an analogous one that happened in Germany around the same time that I remember commenting on.
Oh, yeah. So it happened December 29th. So it was really bad timing because they were attacking wind, photovoltaic farms, heat, and another manufacturing company. So at least in Poland, it hit a bunch of different kind of automation manufacturing locations. And the timing of it was December 29th. So it was right around the holidays. So, staffing was probably not at its normal peaks as it would be at other points in the year. And then additionally, at that time, Poland was experiencing very cold weather. And so the fact that it was an attack on their heat and some of their infrastructure caused a lot of panic and a lot of problems. The good thing is it was able to be stopped before it impacted, people at home and not being able to keep their houses warm. But the attack was extensive, and it definitely did, cause a little bit of panic and uncertainty in the country.
Absolutely. And if I remember correctly, that was a cyber attack.
Yes, it was. They used it had multiple points of entry. So it entered through like internet facing devices, so specifically FortiGate devices. They used wiper malware. It damaged RTUs, HMIs. It caused lack of visibility in environments. It caused lack of control over some of their devices. So it was not a small incident. It caused a lot of issues. So there wasn't a complete blackout, but operators lost remote monitoring. And then what they had to transition into was manual operations for a short stint of time until they were able to regain control. But yeah, it was definitely a problem because the attack targeted the distributed energy resources, not just like centralized utilities or, more of those kind of commercial manufacturing areas. So it was really it had a target, and they definitely had a plan to disrupt the energy sector there.
Yeah, and if I
Yeah.
remember correctly, Mustafa, you go ahead.
This attack actually represented a complete shift in terms of the methodology attackers have been using to compromise this power sector. So the threat actor, which is electric, been involved in a couple of similar infrastructure attacks, was using a methodology to attack a standalone or a distributed edge of of a power generation. But this was a complete shift in terms of a large scale coordinated attack on distributed generation facilities. So the impact and the severity of the attack was completely different than what has been seen in the past.
Yeah, and I mean, I believe it's been attributed to one of the Russian actors, one of the bears. Can't remember which one. There's a few of them. But yeah, I mean, the attack was very sophisticated, like you both said, very deliberately targeted. Wiper malware causing loss of view and control. But equally, if I remember correctly, well, I guess I shouldn't say sophisticated, because sophisticated maybe isn't the right word, because I think at the end of the day, the entry point was the FortiGates. And I think they were configured with static credentials, if I remember correctly, no MFA set up. So
exactly.
Yeah, correct.
So sophisticated maybe isn't the right word, because at the end of the day, it's not particularly sophisticated if you've not actually used all the locks available on your front door.
Exactly. I would say because there was a bit of a difference between the attack that attacked the heat and power plants versus the attacks on the manufacturing. So I think with especially the heat and power plants, like you said, it was like getting access to accounts, which allowed them to like move through the plant systems. But whereas in the manufacturing side, in that side, I think what I read in the reports was it was more of an opportunistic kind of attack, just because once they had kind of access to one, they were able to get access to others. And so I think the methods of attack were a little bit different, but it goes back to the just kind of like the normal housekeeping you should have in an operational environment, especially in critical industries, was just not there, or at least not heavily enforced in at least one of their facilities.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, if you actually like go through the reports on these, yeah, just like you said, like you kind of start checking the boxes on like, oh, right, that happened, right? So the VPN infrastructure was a little bit overexposed versus what it could have been. Static credentials on devices or default credentials on devices. Not a lot of firmware integrity monitoring. It's just like, it's sort of like a laundry list of, oh yeah, all the things that always happened in this kind of attack. And I mean, so it's understandable in some respects because, it's not an excuse, but it's like, it's understandable because, I mean, we do see this again and again in OT. And we've discussed on prior episodes of the podcast why this continues to be an issue in OT. Whether it's the lack of budget to properly roll out a cybersecurity program or the lack of experience on hand to, properly take these steps to secure devices. There's a lot of different causes that kind of feed into it, but the end result is something that we see again and again and again, which is, it's the same password used everywhere on all the, all of the, whatever type of device it is. It's like, this is probably the password. And yeah, that does allow attacks like this to snowball.
Yeah. So I would say it was not a sophisticated attack, but the adversary was kind of very sophisticated, I would say. And if you look at a couple of unique points in terms of security challenges with such infrastructure is that there were a lot of numerous sites which needs to be secured across wider geographic areas. So if you have got standardized configuration across these multiple sites, then even if you are able to successfully penetrate into one site, you can snowball it into multiple repeatable attacks on the same infrastructure across different geographic areas. Another point worth mentioning on this, these kind of infrastructures like remote power generation sites or with a smaller number of power generation capacity, although they feed into the grid, but they are usually built with a tighter cost margins, so which often limits your cybersecurity investment on such smaller sites. these sites require a lot of remote connectivity for operation and maintenance reasons. So they are usually internet facing, or you have to allow the remote access from a central site to manage these remote power generation facilities. In terms of security threshold, if you look at larger facilities, they are at a greater regulatory threshold in terms of their maturity and capability to secure, whereas these smaller sites usually fall back to a less threshold in terms of regulatory compliance. So there are multiple points that actually are worth mentioning, that how this actually resulted into a large scale attack.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about this attack was that, and it was, I actually read this. So CERT Polska or Poland explicitly compared the attack to arson. And so the reason they said that is because this was a attack with purely destructive intent. There wasn't like it wasn't a ransomware, it was an extortion. They just wanted to cause damage. That was their end goal. And so that was like definitely a change from some of the other things we've discussed in the past, where, my ransomware is like a huge thing, but this was a purely, attack with complete destructive intent. And just looking at if you look over the attack chain, the steps that they took to kind of implement this. I mean, like we kind of already said that, when they started, they exploited those Fortinet, FortiGate VPNs and the firewalls. And like we said, there's no MFA, there was static credentials. And so then once they got that first little toehold into the environment, then they're able to kind of laterally move through the OT networks. And so they're able to see what devices there are and identify industrial devices that they could potentially cause damage to. So there's a lot of that kind of, and this was all in those follow-up reports when they're kind of analyzing it to see, where exactly did they get into the OT networks? How far did their access get? And so then eventually, once they had that understanding of the environment, that's when the attackers deployed that custom wiper malware, and they were targeting those HMIs, your OT systems. I think specifically they used Dino Wiper and Lazy Wiper were the two types of malware that were identified. But essentially, the name doesn't matter. What matters is what they did. They were deleting system files, they were corrupting firmware, they were destroying recovery data, and so it wasn't just destruction, but stopping them from being able to recover from these events. And so this was attributed to one of Russia's kind of campaigns, kind of like we mentioned before. But you can see that the people that are responsible for this event, their goal was to the word, I'm losing it. Basically stop them from being able to, have operations and be able to recover from those operations. So there's a lot of kind of nuances to this, but the end goal wasn't just to, ransomware, but the end goal was a bit more severe than that. So I thought that was, definitely kind of critical to note, because now people will definitely be paying attention. And like we said, compliance and regulations are one way to push people to, start taking care of their environment. But, it's events like this that remind us that, not everyone out there is a nice person.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, a couple of points just that you both have said, or a couple of things just came to mind as you were both talking there, rather. First off, and, Mustafa, you touched on this, how, especially when you're dealing with some of these, the photovoltaics, the wind sites, and it's a smaller operator, smaller margins, which is certainly, that's a drum I've banged in regard to water treatment, one of my personal pet concerns. And it's true, right? When you're already on pretty thin margins, yeah, you don't have budget to deploy a lot of the tech that you probably should under the circumstances, and shortcuts inevitably get taken. That's the nature of the beast. And unfortunately, that can lead to security compromises. But the other thing that occurred to me is that it's interesting. I mean, obviously, this was kind of cyber arson, cyber vandalism, however we want to frame it. But what's interesting to me is how quickly it was mitigated. I mean, it took a while to figure out exactly how far they'd gotten in the environment and to put everything back the way it was. But the actual outage period was fairly minimal compared to what happened in Germany, which was the result of actual vandalism and actual arson.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the German case, they, and I believe this was an environmentalist group that did this, but they basically took down distribution. They actually went after the distribution lines and caused significant damage there. And this is something that, I can remember different conversations I've had in all the years that I've worked with NERC-CIP, how cybersecurity is all well and good, but let's talk about physical security, and particularly physical security of distribution lines, because the ability to restore those quickly is finite. Yeah, there is going to be a service group. There is going to be the field group that can go out and repair a downed line. And every power company should have this, because storms happen, snow happens, lines get taken, trees happen, lines get taken down sometimes. And so companies should have the ability to repair these as they happen. But that ability, that capacity for repair is finite based on the amount of spare parts that are available. And if your attack exceeds whatever that threshold is, whatever that capacity is of the ability to replace what's been damaged, well, now you have a bigger problem, because getting more parts in can be a significant delay, which is what happened in the German context. The attackers evidently did their homework. They kind of figured out exactly where the pinch points were that were going to be not quick to replace. And the effect was that there were a lot of places, I don't remember how many tens of thousands of buildings, let alone people, without power for weeks and weeks. And right around that same time frame, and kind of during that same cold snap, and there was real significant concern that lives were going to be lost.
Yeah,
and that one took a longer to recover. Sorry, go, Natalie.
No, you're totally good. Yeah, and I think both of those attacks obviously had kind of different end goals, other than just destruction. But it is also interesting, how even though they're vastly different attacks, they could have been prevented by just basic hygiene of protecting your environment, using simple things maybe not simple all the time, but things like removing static credentials. Something like that could have saved them a big headache, or enforcing multi-factor authentication on all remote access, including your OT vendors, and doing things like inventory and patching edge devices, or like you said, with spare parts, keeping track of what you have, so that you can be prepared for if some of those devices that are bottlenecks or critical in your operation. So you have something that can essentially save you, so you're not waiting for spare parts. So they're all individually quite simple, and obviously when you scale that to larger environments, larger manufacturing facilities or industries, it obviously gets a little bit more tricky. But sometimes you don't even need fancy softwares that can protect you are really good, but just starting out with those basic building blocks to protect your environment is something that most operations can handle if they can prioritize it.
Mm-hmm. But you do need to undertake the exercise of sort of understanding, okay, where are we? What are the things that are actually going to hobble us if something happens? What is actually going to let somebody in the electronic front door, or in the case of a physical attack, what is actually going to be this is the point where if they hit us, we're in trouble, and not just for a day. And sometimes those conversations can be difficult to have, because understanding that doesn't come quickly. Understanding where those points are in your environment, in your system, it doesn't necessarily come easily.
Agreed. And actually, you bringing up that point kind of makes me think of what I would recommend is, if you've ever heard of so obviously you want to have an incident response plan, but how often are you reviewing that incident response plan, or even doing things like a tabletop exercise? So for example, today we're discussing the events that happened in Poland and Germany. And so if you just take those events and try and creatively apply it to your environment and see, would you be prepared if that happened to your operations? Might be a good exercise to figure out, if this happened to you, what would you have done? Would you have been prepared? Would you have been protected? Would you have been able to recover? I think that would be a good first step to kind of figure out, with these scenarios, what would have happened to your environment or your operations.
So yeah, that's a very relevant point in terms of key key controls that the organization should focus is on incident response, having the visibility, and visibility was something which actually helped Poland to identify this attack in first place. So visibility of all the assets and the communication was actually something which really helped them to identify that there's something fishy in our network, and then it triggered an incident response action. So it's very relevant point that Natalie you are bringing, that have you ever rehearsed your OT incident response? What will happen? Who will be communicating? What will be your response? That's something which is very important to run as tabletop.
Yeah. I will say, just kind of bringing this into sort of the more current events, I think there was definitely, I mean, I know when the news first broke out of Poland, there had been some concern that that might have been something akin to like the battle space preparation that we saw the Russians commit in Ukraine ahead of both the annexation of Crimea and then also the 2022 invasion. It seems to have not been the case. It was about much more opportunistic attack. And I guess if you have to pick the kind of attack you're going to suffer, that's probably better than, you know, being in the path of some sort of actual battle space preparation. It occurs to me that, and granted, during an active military campaign, we're not always privileged to be given this information. But it seems to me that with the recent efforts against Iran, that the U.S. has undertaken, that Israel has undertaken, there haven't been a lot of stories about this same sort of like cyberspace battle prep going into the country. There's certainly been a lot of kinetic strikes on Iranian infrastructure, gas, power, but we didn't hear a lot about cyber attacks.
There was actually one cyber attack which happened on Stryker, which is actually medical technology giant. So they manufacture medical devices. So on March of 11th, the hacker group Handala, which is believed to be related to Ministry of Intelligence and Security from Iran, wiped more than 200,000 devices, which forced Stryker to shut down some of its offices across countries. And again, similar attack vectors were used in this attack as well. So they compromised Microsoft's Intune instance, which is used for remotely managing the desktops and mobile endpoints. So this was actually compromised using an InfoStealer malware to gain the initial credentials. And again, Viper malware was used. So we are seeing this kind of similar methodology and trend, which is using of Viper malwares to wipe out a lot of devices or systems.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a super scary one, because when I was reading up on it, essentially what it did was it forced factory resets on 200,000 resets, so devices. So it was a very large scale attack. I think it was impacted 80 countries and devices. And I think part of it was almost like a psychological attack, because, people were scared because, some Stryker supplies things like defibrillators and implants and, surgical robots. And so if, some of those devices are impacted, that can, affect, millions of patients everywhere around the world. So yeah, that was a very, scary attack to learn about, just because it's impacting like the healthcare field, which we all kind of depend on.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that Stryker was attributed to the Iranians. And yeah, you're right. Like, that is definitely a cyber attack that emerged out of this conflict. I was talking about more, and again, we're not always privy to these things, not being top secret clearance eligible. But I was thinking more in terms of like, if there were any major cyber attacks directed against Iran prior to the military operations that have been ongoing for 3 or 4 weeks now, none of it reached my ears. I didn't hear about any of it.
Yeah, on that point, you are right. I haven't heard any of the attacks which were targeted towards Iran before the actual war started.
But I guess that does, the Stryker thing does underscore the fact that now cyber attacks are also within the tool set of a nation state to retaliate for a cyber attack.
Yeah, it's like in their tool set, because I was just thinking, I don't think I heard of any attacks kind of like you were mentioning that happened directly before conflict started. But definitely, over the last decades, we definitely saw some attacks due to, things like wiper attacks or attacking, the financial industry or infrastructure. But just doing some quick research while we're on the call now, most of those things, at least the ones that were public knowledge, all happened in the 2010s. Not as much has been vocally shown in the 2020s, at least. Not that it didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I mean, of course, there are
Well,
other.
yeah.
Go on, Mustafa.
So while doing some research in terms of identifying recent incidents from 2025 to 2026, I could see a couple of wiper malware against Israeli organizations, so which was one of the pyroxene threat group deployed wiper malwares against Israeli organizations. And I've seen some Iranian oil refinery campaign, which was again targeting or Libyan oil refinery, and GPS spoofing and vessel disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, some GPS scanning and spoofing of electronic interferences in the maritime networks. So there are attacks which if we connect dots somehow leads that there is actually cyber espionage happening before actual war starts.
Yeah. Well, scary new world. And I guess especially, as we continue to advance in our ability, or rather nation states continue to advance in their capabilities to cause damage, to cause havoc, there's going to be those low-hanging fruit, the smaller operations with the lower margins are only going to become ever more tempting targets, especially with things like power, I think, because if you can introduce even a little bit of instability into the power grid, that can have significant ripple effects across the entire grid. Power grids are not absurdly fault tolerant, shall we say. And that happened somewhere too. I want to say, there was a big power outage in like Spain or somewhere where I think, I don't remember all the details, but it started with a little bit of instability in the grid, and it basically just cascaded across a significant portion of the country. Might not have been Spain, but in my head, I think that's what I remember. Like I say, I don't have all the details here in front of me, but I remember hearing about that sometime last year. And from what I understand of, power grids here in like North America, it didn't surprise because, the grid is only so resilient and it's only so tolerant of perturbations in the amount of load on it. And if you can exceed those by even a little bit, it might be enough to cause a rather large disruption without ever having to actually go after one of the large providers.
Yeah, and you're remembering right, it was Spain. I think technically it affected the whole Iberian Peninsula because once it started in Spain, it kind of trickled down and impacted Portugal as well. But essentially, from what I recall, it was like some voltage instability that caused kind of their entire power system to collapse. I think the shocking thing of that event was it all happened within like a couple minutes. Like it wasn't an event that was like ramping up. No, it just happened kind of instantaneously and impacted many people. And I think they had lost power for I think it was like a day. I think it was like almost like a full day. So it impacted transportation. It impacted telecommunications. So there was if you can just get at something as simple as power, you can pretty much affect the entire infrastructure of a country. So yeah, that was an event that I think I don't believe it was attributed to an attack. I just believe it was more of like a instability in the infrastructure kind of event.
Yeah, and Ken has brought up a very good point in terms of power sector being compromised in such conditions. And if I go back to 2021, Indian power sector was really targeted by some state-sponsored attackers because there were some tensions on the borders between neighboring countries. And again, if we go back to 2025, in which again there was some tensions between neighboring countries in India, and during one of the operations that Indian government was conducting on the neighboring country. There was 2 lakh attacks on power sectors during that operations. So this is something worth mentioning, that power sector is really targeted heavily during such geopolitical tensions.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and it makes sense that it would be because, and we saw this probably illustrated most directly in Ukraine, but having access to power or being able to topple power supplies is that has very significant impacts on the country that is suffering the attack, because now they're that doesn't just affect the ability to keep the streetlights on. Now we're talking parts of their communication infrastructure are going to go down, those that aren't protected by redundant power systems, or things like Starlink, which you can run off of a backpack. It's going to impact so much of the combat environment, and it's going to give a significant advantage to the attacker coming in. So it totally makes sense that power would be in the crosshairs of any conventional military operation.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Ukraine, and I know just recently they had a cyber attack on their railways. So again, another piece of, core infrastructure that is, impacting daily operations. And so, yeah, it's definitely impacting both the civilians and military.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess that we've presented so many problems, maybe we should present some solutions or ideas for what you can do.
Exactly.
So.
Well, I was just trying to wander into that direction. And I mean, you touched on it earlier, I think, because at the end of the day, it really does come down, well, we've all kind of touched on it here, but different points of it, right? It's, understanding where those, and I mean, the fancy terms are like, crown jewels analysis, risk analysis, asset management, right? It's like understanding what you have, understanding which parts of what you have are like the key pieces. And if I lose this, everything follows. Versus if I lose that, I can limp along for a few days and I'm okay. And then also being able to, once you've identified what you have and where your major risk factors are, actually being able to figure out what you're going to do about it, right? Whether that's to shore up your existing defenses or to say, okay, well, we need to make sure we have a couple more of those in spare parts because one is not enough.
Agreed. And I think one other thing that I had a discussion with one of our customers earlier this week is, when you're looking at the devices you have in your environment, so obviously you need to know they're there. But then when you're looking at like what risks or vulnerabilities they have, a lot of people will look at maybe like all the CVSS or CVEs that are assigned to those devices, which is a really good way of kind of giving you an idea of, what risks that device has. But a lot of, those CVSS scores that you get from CVEs, like they don't exactly correlate to operational risk. And why that's important is because you might have like a really high CVSS score, like, almost out of 10. But you might also have a device that has a vulnerability with a really low CVSS score. So maybe it's like 5 or less than that. But maybe that, lower ranked CVSS score has a higher operational impact for you. And so that's the more critical device. And so it's not linear, which is why you need to kind of understand what these vulnerabilities are that might impact your devices. But also, that operational risk, like, how is that device going to impact your operations? Yeah, those are kind of things I was thinking about when we're looking at, ranking even devices to figure out, okay, how do you know which ones to protect first?
Yeah.
And something which I've noticed with a couple of asset owners focusing on is they call it as a fix the basic or minimal cybersecurity controls. So although they might be tight on the budget, but they are stressing that at least do the bare minimum, which is create a defensible architecture by segmenting the network, having the bare minimum of VLANs configured so that you are separating the safety network and the process network. You are doing the basic hardening, not using the static credentials like what was compromised in the Poland attack. So these are a couple of points which must be stressed. Tool is great. A lot of people start focusing with the tool first. Although definitely you will need a tool, for example, for asset visibility or the inventory of the systems, knowing the communication, that certainly will come. But start with something which will not really be a deep hole in your pocket, and will certainly give you a lot of return on investment in terms of cyber security hygiene.
Yep. And I mean, again, being sensitive to cost, but this really is a case of where if you don't have the expertise in-house, it is possible to make the argument to bring that expertise in, even if it does cost a little bit more. I think we're getting better. We still see this crop up. I still see it crop up in places where, security efforts in general, IT, OT, whatever, are mainly just seen as cost centers. And it can be hard to free up a budget for them, but it is possible still to have that conversation and make the case that if we spend so much now to prevent an order of magnitude of loss later, I know it's a hard sell. That's never an easy conversation to have, but that is the conversation that has to be had. And even if it's not, the entirety of the security budget, if it's the sort of conversation that can get you even just a little bit extra to buy a week of someone's time to have them come in and advise, that's probably worth the exercise, because this stuff is pretty complicated, and it's okay to not necessarily understand it. It's okay to not necessarily have that expertise in-house and on hand. If you're able to, bring that expertise in and act on some of their advice, of course, then the onus is on the expertise you bring in to hand you actionable advice. You talked about CVEs, and yeah, it's absolutely wonderful that, okay, cool, I can run this scanner and I can show you a list of all the CVEs that might apply to your network. And now I have an Excel spreadsheet with 2,000 lines in it. And what am I going to do with all this? So it is, it definitely does depend on the quality of advice that you're bringing in. But bringing in the advice is, if you genuinely need it, is something to advocate for, because it isn't necessarily reasonable to expect that every power provider, every water provider, whatever, is going to have the necessary expertise in-house.
Yeah, agreed.
Sure.
And I think go for it.
Yeah, go ahead, Natalie. No. And that's why, and this is a very nice point in terms of bringing the expertise, and a lot of consultants and service providers have come up with this concept of virtual security advisor or a cyber security consultant. So you don't have to have those staff permanently on board. You can leverage them on certain hourly or weekly or monthly basis and get the expertise for a particular infrastructure. And this helps asset owner to leverage expertise from different skill sets. So having someone only for power grid and at the same time securing other different systems might be difficult. But if you are having different OEM systems, different kind of like solar power plant and desalination plant, or a combined water and heat plants, so you can leverage those services as a virtual CISO or a virtual consultant.
Yeah, and to play off of what you guys both said, and something I mentioned earlier is we discuss all these incidents happening, around the world, different, environments and industries, and you of course can use those as a test. So, take that incident that we talked about in Germany or in Poland or in the Ukraine and see, how you would have reacted in that environment, but then wonder like what should you do, or how do you react to it, or how do you prepare? And if you're struggling to find those answers, that's exactly the point where, the point that Ken and Mustafa are making is that's when you should definitely, ask for that extra help. And that might be a good way of representing to, your leadership that, hey, we did this internal exercise and we, I guess you don't want to say we don't know the answer, but we don't know what the best answer is. How do we prepare for this? And so I think that would be a good first step, is to just kind of evaluate how prepared is your team to kind of respond to an event like this, or prepare for events like these.
Yeah, exactly. And it could be an argument for bringing in, virtual expertise, right? The virtual CISO that Mustafa mentioned, or a virtual analyst. It could be an argument for, adding some headcount, even part-time or even on a temporary basis. Ideally, again, budgets are what they are, and they can't necessarily increase by as much as anybody would like them to, but even a little bit might make the difference between, whoops, that VPN connection was left way less secure than it should have been, and not. And sometimes all it takes is just finding those low-hanging fruit and eliminating them, and or at least mitigating as many of them as possible. Because going back to the Poland attack, it wasn't sophisticated in terms of how they got in. Their methodology was reasonably competent. Once they were in the environment, they would just move between devices, and they knew what they were doing. But how they got in was, it was not sophisticated. And I'm glad I walked that word back, because it's kind of the same laundry list of things that we see in so many of these breach cases. Even the thing with Stryker and the Intune. The Intune also was an MFA failure. They didn't have it properly set up for all of the admin accounts, if I remember correctly. It's these little things. If you're at the point where the attacker has to start burning 0 days to compromise you, you're in a good position, because any attacker who's willing to burn 0 days to attack you is going to get into your environment anyways. You're basically dealing with nation state at that point. And at that point, your strategy is less keeping them out and more about mitigation. But if you can do what you can to eliminate from your environment all the ways that an attacker wouldn't have to burn a 0 day in order to get in, like that proper MFA setup, like hardening your VPN connections, like getting rid of default credentials where you can. Those low-hanging fruit that make it so much easier to just walk through the door. That will already give you an advantage.
That brings a very good important point in terms of how to leverage open source intelligence for knowing your attack surface. A lot of people are spending millions of dollars in doing risk assessments and getting great reports, but having this open source intelligence leverage to find out what is connected on internet, what exactly the attackers could see on our website, that what products we are using or what manufacturing technologies we are using. There are a lot of internet-based search engines like Shodan and Senses that can be leveraged to find out these low-hanging fruits, and it is a proactive approach that asset owners or the operators can utilize to find out these low-hanging fruits and then try securing it.
Exactly. And I mean, we do have some software that is helpful in finding at least some of the low-hanging fruit.
Agreed. Well, we've really spanned the world today. We went from Poland to the Persian Gulf, back to the Iberian Peninsula with all these attacks happening everywhere.
It's a global problem.
It is a global problem, and there are global conflicts that will definitely, cause more problems for all of us and a lot of headaches.
Yep. But I do think that the reasonable takeaway in all of this is there is something to be studied in these attacks, because a lot of the ones that we've discussed today kind of all had the same fundamental set of weaknesses that enabled them to happen the way that they did. And most of those are not wildly complicated things. I mean, setting up MFA is not for the faint of heart, but it's not so arcane that, only the very best and brightest can do it. We've come a long way where MFA is concerned. We've come a long way where the ability to manage passwords is concerned. And these are things that if you can just take care of these things and a few other things like them, that will do a lot to mitigate the amount, or that will do a lot to mitigate the exposure to risk that's there. And a lot of those mitigations are doable even on shoestring-ish budgets. So if there's a takeaway from that, is that there is some hope in this, even if the budgets are thin, because a lot of these attacks exploit the same weaknesses time and time again. And you can take any of these attack reports and read, oh, they did this, then they did this, then they did this. Well, how could they do that to us? Oh, shoot, we don't have MFA on that. Can we get MFA on there? Oh, shoot, you know what? I think we did reuse some credentials across our switches. Can we change that? Those are conversations that you can have today without even necessarily bringing in outside expertise. And they're things that you can mitigate today. Maybe bring in some outside expertise to implement MFA if you need help there. But it's oftentimes the same script again and again and again. And you can read these attack reports and you can see what they did. And you can ask if that can happen in your environment. And if it can, you can act on it. And you can act on it fairly quickly without having to bring in a ton of outside help necessarily. And if you can eliminate those low-hanging fruit, then you're in a much better position. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. So I will say that is it for this month. And we're happy to be recording again now that last month's perturbation in the schedule has been addressed. You've been listening to OT After Hours, rather a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, out of practice, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Please do share our episodes with your friends, your family, colleagues, and anyone else you think would be interested in industrial cybersecurity. And please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast has been produced by me, Kenneth Cooley. Our opening and closing music is by the ever-so-talented Octosound. Look them up if you need some music for a podcast or a video. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Mustafa, and welcome again. And thank you out there for listening. We will talk to you soon.